Hello guys and welcome to today's live stream. And today is the 14th of April 2022 and that means 110 years ago today the Titanic would have hit that iceberg in the North Atlantic, and the time of this premiere will be around an hour to maybe an hour and a half before Titanic strikes that iceberg. And at exactly 11:39 or 11:40 there will be a 2-minute silence for all those lives lost in the disaster that fateful night of April 14th, 1912. But obviously just throughout the stream guys, we're just gonna watch videos and all that for it.
The Titanic is an event that has left an indelible mark on the face of modern humanity.
Yep.
Though the tragedy occurred more than 100 years ago, the average citizen still knows about the supposed unsinkable ship.
Yep.
But few people know what really occurred on board. Today we're looking at 10 incredible facts about the Titanic. It's well documented that the Titanic had many rich patrons. Because of the unsinkable ship's notoriety, the world's ultra-wealthy lined up to get on board. This included an American businessman named John Jacob Astor IV. Not only was he the richest man on board, he is widely believed to be the richest living man at the time. His net worth at the time of his death was $87 million.
Wow.
That's equivalent to $2.3 billion when adjusted for inflation.
Wow, that's a
Astor
lot.
left behind a number of accomplishments. He was a decorated military veteran and also wrote a popular science fiction novel called A Journey in Other Worlds.
That's cool.
Like generations of Astors before him, he also made millions in real estate. In 1897, Astor built the Astoria Hotel, dubbed the world's most luxurious hotel in New York City, adjoining the Waldorf Hotel owned by Astor's cousin
still around now.
William. The complex became known as the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and is still one of the most iconic hotels in the world more than 100 years later. Tragically, Astor perished with his family dog Kitty. His wife and unborn child, who were on board, managed to survive and inherited his prodigious wealth.
Good.
Violet Jessup is either the luckiest or the unluckiest woman in the world.
This is pretty crazy, right? Before we continue there, this lady was on all three of the ships. She was on the Olympic when they had that collision with HMS Hawk, Titanic sinking, and the Britannic sinking.
Depending
all
on your
three
perception,
ships. She was on
she was
them
a
all
British
and
nurse who
survived
grew
all
up
of
in
them.
Argentina. She was 24 when she first boarded the Titanic, where she was working as a nurse. Jessup was not quite asleep when the Titanic hit the iceberg. She later wrote, "I was ordered up on deck. Calmly, passengers strolled about. I stood at the bulkhead with the other stewardesses, watching the women cling to their husbands before being put into the boats with their children." After 8 hours, Jessup became one of the small percentage of Titanic passengers and crew rescued by the Carpathia. 4 years later, she was on board the Titanic's sister ship, the Britannic, when it sank in the Aegean Sea due to an unexplained explosion. Britannic sank within 55 minutes, killing 30 out of the 1,066 people on board. British authorities hypothesized that the ship was either struck by a torpedo or hit a mine planted by German forces. Remarkably, Jessup survived both of these capsized ships that were once believed to be unsinkable. In addition, she had been on board RMS Olympic, the eldest of the three sister ships, when it collided with a British warship called the HMS Hawk.
That's crazy,
Though it
right?
didn't sink, it
This
was still
person was on
remarkable
all
that she
three
was on
ships
board all three
during
unlucky
their
ships.
darkest moments.
Back before James Cameron was known as one of the most successful filmmakers of all time, he was a sci-fi filmmaker attempting to create a big-budget blockbuster about a cruise ship sinking 100 years ago.
Oh yeah,
no, and it quickly became the most popular movie in history. When Titanic came out in 1997, it was the highest-grossing film of all time, with a worldwide box office of over $1.8 billion. By some measures, it was the most viewed movie ever. But the film was not cheap to produce either. It cost a whopping $200 million,
which is funny because
especially
this film
in
costs
1990s
more
money was
to
a
make.
ton of cash.
Like,
Today,
this film costs more than it actually cost to make Titanic itself, which when that was just for inflation, it was 195 million. So it was $5 million more than
was
to make than the actual
It was
ship
constructed
was.
in 1912 for a total cost of $7.5 million.
Yep.
Even adjusted for inflation, that is just $190
$90 million, I got it wrong, but yeah, you see, it costs more to make the film than it did to make
turned out to be much
to
more
make the ship.
successful than that of the unfortunate ship of the same name.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that the Titanic was the largest ship ever constructed at the time of sinking, it still took 73 years to find its wreckage.
Yep.
Understandably, the ocean is vast,
It's vast,
and even after numerous
the
dedicated rescue missions,
actually, and this is what I found out, turns out, so you know when the crew was like having to pinpoint their location during the sinking, they actually had the location wrong of like where they were, and the Titanic was like a couple hundred feet or a couple hundred meters off.
In the end, authorities gave up, and many decades passed before the Titanic was discovered by accident. The 1985 discovery of the Titanic stemmed from a secret United States Navy investigation of 2 wrecked nuclear submarines, according to the oceanographer who found the infamous ocean liner. Essentially, the discovery was part of a top-secret mission during the Cold War, but the Navy was sworn to secrecy on the matter until recently. On September 1st, 1985, a joint American-French expedition, headed by famous American oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard, found the Titanic over 2 miles below the ocean's surface by using an unmanned submersible called Argo. This discovery gave new meaning to the Titanic sinking and gave birth to new dreams in ocean exploration. The initial purpose of the trip was to discover if there was any nuclear waste left over from 2 nearby submarines. But in the end, the mission was fruitful and led to the most famous underwater discovery in history. It's no secret that the sinking of the Titanic was a deadly disaster. But the truth is that the vast majority of the passengers died in the wreckage. Over 1,500 people died in the maritime disaster, while 705 individuals survived. Researcher Chuck Anesi crunched the numbers, breaking down the demographics of the survivors. He found that 97% of the 144 female first-class passengers were rescued, while only 32% of their 175 male counterparts were saved. Ultimately, he found that male second-class passengers fared the worst in terms of survival, with only 14 out of 168 making it out alive.
Here's the thing, right? Here's the thing, though. The reason this happened was because one of the
Another
people
terrible
on
tragedy
Titanic,
is that the boat hosted many family
at the
pets.
time,
Though
women
their
killed them
quarters were
first,
opened after the ship began to sink,
one of the
only
crew
2 of
members
them managed to survive. For one passenger named
it was only women and
this may
children.
have led to her
Women and
own
children
demise.
only, not women and children
Legend
first.
states she probably
So
died
that
because she
basically
did not
men
want to
couldn't
leave
get on
behind
one
her
side of
Great
the ship. I
Dane
mean,
after
if no
the
one
ship
could get on,
began
they
to
can only
sink.
get on a
The woman
certain
was
side.
reportedly sighted in the water with her arms frozen around a dog. In the end, she was only one of 4 first-class women who perished.
Oh wow.
Eliza Gladys Milvina Dean was a British civil
Yeah, and
servant
she was the very last
cartographer and
survivor
the
of the
last
Titanic
survivor of the
disaster.
sinking of the RMS Titanic. At 2 months old, she was also the youngest passenger aboard.
On board, yeah.
Her parents had decided to leave England for America, where her father had family in Kansas and hoped to open a tobacco shop. The Deans had not chosen to be aboard the Titanic, but because of a coal strike, they were transferred to the ship and boarded it as third-class passengers at Southampton. Her father felt the crunch of the ship's collision with the iceberg on the night of the 14th of April 1912 and went up to investigate. He returned to their cabin, telling his wife to dress the children and go up on deck. Though she doesn't remember it, Dean and her mother and siblings survived, while her father perished in the tragic accident. As soon as Dean reached the shore, reporters crowded her, hoping to snap a photo of the Titanic infant. Almost 100 years later, she passed away at her senior home in England. Her ashes were scattered from a launch at the docks in Southampton, where the Titanic set sail. In the final years of her life, her housing bills were paid by Leo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet, and James Cameron.
Oh, that's cool.
The Titanic was a singular ship with some crazy statistics to back it up. For example, the ship was 883 feet long, burned 825 tons of coal a day, and used more than 10,000 light bulbs. Though many people perished during the crash, there were actually 2 workers who passed away during construction. In addition, the anchor was so heavy that it took 20 horses to transport it. The Titanic had a maximum capacity of 3,500 passengers, though there were roughly 2,300 on board when it sank. Of these, there were 13 honeymooning couples. This was not a very festive way to celebrate their marriage. Each lifeboat had a capacity of 65 people, though there were only 28 on the first boat.
Yeah, no, let me say this. So basically, the reason there's only 20 lifeboats was because basically there would intentionally meant to be 48 carried, which would have been roughly around here. But no, it would have been enough. But basically, Titanic's on scientists was basically, you know, like, basically the decks are going to be too cluttered, and yeah, and they basically reduced the amount of luggage down to 20, which of course, you know, proved fatal.
Because they assumed they would never need them.
Yep.
On board, there were 1,000 bottles of wine and 40,000 fresh
Titanic
eggs.
Was going to be
An amazing
unthinkable,
14,000 gallons of drinking water
but
was drunk every day.
Right from
Miraculously,
the start,
the Titanic received 6 iceberg warnings before finally colliding with a massive icy monolith. 31% of the passengers survived, but 53% could have survived if the boat was properly prepared. The ship currently rests at 12,600 feet below sea level.
Hit it head on.
The Titanic was the largest ship in the world for its time. It was longer than the famous Lusitania, built in 1906, by more than 100 feet. The Lusitania itself was 790 feet in length. Before construction of the ship, 3 berths at the Belfast shipyard had to be modified to accommodate the Titanic and its 2 sister ships, the Britannic and the Olympic. Also, across the Atlantic, modifications had to be made to the pier in New York City Harbour to receive these larger ships. The Titanic and its sister ships did not hold the distinction of being the largest ships for long, even though they were 883 feet from bow to stern. By 1934, the luxury cruise ship, the Queen Mary, took the honour of being the longest and largest ship. It beat the Titanic's length by 136 feet. It was 1,019 feet long. That's the equivalent of more than 3 football fields laid end to end.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It was not until the 1990s that another cruise ship was built longer than the Queen Mary. But the current largest ship in the world absolutely dwarfs the Titanic. With 18 decks and 7 neighbourhoods, Royal Caribbean's Symphony of the Seas is the world's largest cruise ship. At 1,188 feet, it's more than 300 feet longer than the Titanic and can house in excess of 5,000 more people.
But that's crazy.
Frederick Fleet is a British man who is famous for a very unfortunate reason. Along with fellow lookout Reginald Lee on duty aboard the Titanic when the ship struck the iceberg, it was Fleet who first sighted the iceberg, rigging the bridge to proclaim iceberg right ahead. On the evening of April 14th, the Titanic began to approach an area known to have icebergs. The captain slightly altered the ship's course to head farther south. However, he maintained the ship's speed of about 22 knots. Fleet and Lee were stationed in the crow's nest of the Titanic. Their task was made difficult by the fact that the ocean was unusually calm that night.
It was really calm.
There would be little water breaking at its base, an iceberg would be more difficult to spot. In addition, the crow's nest binoculars were missing.
This was the most stupid thing that ever happened. So basically, there was actually binoculars on Titanic, but they couldn't receive them because basically, I think it was like 2 days before Titanic set sail, one of the crew members was switched out of the Titanic, and they packed their stuff so fast, and that person had the keys to the binoculars locker, which basically meant without the keys they couldn't get the binoculars out, which meant Titanic was fucked if it got an iceberg because they would have to see it with their plain eyes, and apparently it took about 40 seconds from seeing the iceberg to collision.
Fleet later attested that if they had binoculars, he believed they could have saved the ship. Apparently this information weighed on his spirit because Fleet hanged himself in 1965. It turns out fake news has been around for at least 100 years. On hearing that the Titanic sank, nearly all news agencies, including the Daily Mail, the Belfast Telegraph and the World, reported that there were no casualties on board in order to maintain calm. However, this also gave false hope to the families of the passengers who learned of their friends and families passing in a cruel twist of fate. In Baltimore, the Sun's Evening Sun for April 15th devoted its entire first page to the disaster under the Good News banner and headlines, "All Titanic passengers are safe, transferred in lifeboats at sea." But other newspapers had the same story. In New York, the Evening Sun also exulted, "All saved from Titanic after collision." Some papers even reported that the ship didn't sink. The first paragraph of the Halifax Nova Scotia story states, held afloat only by her waterproof compartments, the Great White Star liner Titanic is slowly crawling towards this harbour. The Oswego Daily Times used a United Press Association story reporting the Titanic.
And the other thing, like, it didn't happen till like 2 days later, like after she sank, that they finally got the real news, like about, and like fatalities came in, and yeah. That's the first video, guys.
Later, it's easy to think that we know everything about what went wrong on the Titanic that fateful night.
Yep, 110 years ago today.
Well, actually, there's a lot of stuff that we don't know about, and the internet is here to tell us.
I know a lot of the stuff. I know like a lot, even I know a lot of the minor stuff.
From the truth about the ship's current state to the newspaper's horrific mistake. Let's take a look at 15 bone-chilling Titanic facts no one knew.
Yep.
Number 15. Why the Titanic can't be raised. Yes, much like an overly confident investment banker during a game of poker, the Titanic can't be raised. But in this case, we can all agree that the Titanic has an altogether better reason for this unique set of circumstances. It would fall apart. Efforts to salvage the Titanic so far have been pretty disappointing, with the biggest recovery being a slab of hull currently on display in a Las Vegas hotel. Unfortunately, the ocean's hostile waters have attacked and all but destroyed the ship's remains in the past century, making any full recovery impossible. Thanks to the saltwater's acidity and microbes presence, the ship has eroded so much that it would completely crumble if anybody tried to mess with it. And if you want some more pessimism, who doesn't? Scientists have discovered an aggressive organism that has destroyed so much of the Titanic that they believe the whole ship will be gone by 2030. Well, isn't that...
The absolute latest they said Titanic could survive under there is 2037, which is 15 years from now, which could mean if Titanic's still around by then, that means Titanic will only survive
Just
for 125th anniversary.
You wait 100 years for a chance to save a historically significant boat and some unspecified sea bacteria destroy it for a snack. This planet is out of control. Before we go on, like this video, smash the subscribe button. Fake news. Even back in the early 20th century, newspapers were still reckoning with the incredible impact that misleading or mistake-ridden news could have. On the day following the Titanic sinking, one British newspaper made what could be the most unintentionally horrific mistake a newspaper ever made. On Tuesday, April 16th, 1912, just one day following the Titanic sinking, British newspaper The Daily Mail reported that, yes, the ship had collided with an iceberg, but no lives had been lost. Of course, we know that this isn't exactly how things happened, and I'm sure those working at the Daily Mail at the time also became familiar with the truth very, very quickly. While things were obviously different technologically at the time, this is the kind of mistake that no newspaper wants to make, especially not without a quick way to correct the error. You can bet somebody got fired for this blunder. If you ask a Brit, they'll probably tell you that this is actually one of the Daily Mail's better mistakes, but that doesn't mean this should have ever happened. Actually, this is a classic case of a newspaper pushing to get the story out quick. And you know what happens when people rush to finish something quick, right? They ramble on like I am right now, trying to fulfill a word count. Word. Number 13. Hypothermic death.
A lot
the story of the
of people
Titanic is a
die from
tragic one
hypothermia
from the
because
beginning
the water was
to end. What should have been an amazingly unforgettable experience became a tragically unforgettable one. That becomes even more viscerally true when you discover that most people would have died in a matter of minutes.
I think it's the maximum that people could survive is 15 to 20 minutes in the water.
At the same time that the Titanic sank, the water temperature was around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a temperature below freezing, so it doesn't take a genius to know that no human could survive those kinds of extreme conditions. Few people could have survived longer than 15 minutes, and it's believed that around 1 in 5 died within 2 minutes of touching the water. That's a pretty chilling, horrifying thought. Most of these victims didn't die of the impact or anything else, but simply the extreme conditions conditions
Yeah,
their body
the
wasn't
absolute
equipped to
conditions.
handle.
And if
There's
they had
nothing
more
about the
lifeboats, I
Titanic
don't
sinking
think would have
that
been an
can be
issue, but because of the
described
amount
as
of lifeboats,
anything other than
people had
tragic.
no choice
But this
but to
simple
literally
fact is definitely
people
one
literally
of the
had to
most harrowing.
jump in
To
the
imagine the
water.
confusion and the shock as your body begins tensing with hypothermia.
Yep.
This isn't the way anybody should see the end of their lives.
Yeah.
Number 12. The musicians played on.
Yeah.
While James Cameron's Titanic may have its share of haters, the movie is actually very true to the way things happened. Sure, Jack and Rose may not have existed, but the rest of the ship, it's pretty close actually. But one part was absolutely true, and it's very moving. 8 musicians were on board the Titanic, performing as 2 separate groups, a quintet and a trio, and playing at different times on different ship sections. But the real story begins when the ship hit the iceberg. As the boat began to sink and the passengers began to panic, the musicians took this as their opportunity to calm everyone down using their craft.
They were great. They were great for doing that.
As the ship slowly sank into the freezing cold waters, the band played on to the bitter end. As portrayed in the film, these men all perished, and their bodies were never recovered. The Titanic Orchestra have rightly been remembered for their incredible heroism, as much as for their art. Titanic survivors continue to recall their incredible actions, with one describing it in these beautifully haunting words. The music they played served alike as their own immortal requiem, and their right to be recalled on the scrolls of undying fame. Number 11. The nearby ship. There may be no more devastating fact about the Titanic than they could have been saved, but it's true. Just 20 miles away, there was another ship that could have saved those passengers, but chose not to. The full story is even sadder. 20 miles away from the Titanic's eventual shipwreck, the SS Californian had come to a stop to avoid that very iceberg that was currently sinking its fellow vessel. Meanwhile, the crew of the Titanic, in an obvious state of panic, began firing flares in a desperate attempt to get help. As luck would have it, the crew of the SS Californian saw these flares. Unfortunately, the captain, Stanley Lord, chose to ignore them, believing they were company rockets. This single act forever changed the course of history, and when the SS Californian received the Titanic's SOS calls the following day, it quickly dawned on them what had happened. By the time the Californian had arrived at the scene of the tragedy, it was too late. All they found were bodies floating in the freezing cold water. The captain's inaction had cost over 1,500 lives, and he spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name. Number 10. Canceled drill. Obviously, the story of the Titanic is filled with many poor decisions, but as with any shipwreck,
on April 14th, which is today, 110 years ago, actually, a couple hours ago, at 12 AM on that day, there was already a lifeboat drill for some reason they cancelled it, and we never found out why.
The cancelling of key drills is probably up here as one of the biggest mistakes made by this unsinkable ship. On the same day of the Titanic's sinking, a planned lifeboat drill was cancelled by Captain Smith, but for some reason, nobody fully understands why exactly he decided to cancel the drill. The generally accepted consensus is that the exercise was scrapped to allow passengers to attend their church services, because obviously an unsinkable ship would never need to use their lifeboats anyway. To make matters worse, the Titanic was built to hold 32 lifeboats, but those in charge decided to decrease the clutter and only hold 20, enough for 1,178 people. For context, the ship could carry around 3,300 people, and that includes crew members. This critical lapse in security proved to be one of the costliest decisions in history. Even if the lifeboats on board had been filled to their capacity, only a third would have survived, and, of course, without the drill, chaos would still have ensued. By today's standards, all of this is a complete collapse of basic safety rules. But by 1912's rules, this actually exceeded many safety requirements. Make of that what you will. Number 9. The Mirage. We tend to think of mirages as only existing in mega hot places like the desert, but that's not entirely true.
Yeah.
While the circumstances definitely exist to experience this unique phenomenon in the desert, you can also experience it, well, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
According to experts, the Atlantic Ocean conditions on that fateful night
were no
ripe
moon,
for super refraction. I'll spare you the science I don't fully understand, but when a thermal inversion abnormally refracts light, objects can create a false horizon, warping what is actually there in a mirage-type manner. According to British historian Tim Moulton, this likely happened to the Titanic crew and the Californian. This would explain why the Californian captain dismissed the flares. The mirage altered the horizon to make the rockets look far too low to be coming from the Titanic, and why the Titanic's crew could not see the iceberg. The super refraction mirage is a complicated scientific theory, but it certainly makes sense. But it's kind of harrowing to think so many passengers lost their lives due to a rare and very difficult to see optical illusion.
I lost 30 pounds.
I lost 60 pounds using
Difficult to see optical
Well,
illusion.
guys, right now it's
Number 8.
10:38, which means in
No,
1
we're
hour's
not going to
time.
start selling you a story
1
about how
hour's
the full
time,
moon brought out a werewolf on the ship.
we'll
That'd be
be
pretty
getting
insane.
ready
Actually,
for-
scientists
we'll
now
be getting
believe
ready
that a
for,
unique
you know,
phenomenon involving the full moon
the
contributed to or even caused the sinking of the Titanic.
Yeah,
On the
no,
night
it's
of
crazy,
the
because
Titanic's
there's
eventual
no
sinking,
moon
there was
at all,
no
none
moon
of
in
the
sight. So, what are the scientists talking about?
Yeah.
Well, their theory claims that an ultra-rare alignment of the sun, the full moon, and the Earth just 3 months before the disaster may have set the tragedy in motion ahead of time. That probably sounds insane, but stick with me. When the circumstances between these three are right, the planet sees a phenomenon known as a spring tide. Low tides lower than usual, and vice versa. In January 1912, the world saw the closest lunar approach since 796 AD, bringing extremely high tides.
Got a high tide 3 months prior to the
Scientists
disaster.
believe that these high tides broke off a brand new crop of
Yeah,
icebergs
and
from
then
glaciers
high
in the
tides, they're
Atlantic,
breaking the
likely
front
from
of the
Canada.
iceberg.
By the time the Titanic sailed
It
into
would've
these
made
waters,
the
they were
iceberg
probably
pushed
filled
that
with
whole
floating
way,
icebergs.
right
What
when
do
the
you
Titanic
think
got
about
there.
this theory? Scientific genius or hokum? Let us know in the
Very
comments.
plausible, 'cause they are
Number 7.
plausible.
The Whiskey Survivor.
Oh,
It's
I
the kind of
did
thing
this
you'd read on
before.
The Onion,
I'm not gonna
but
talk
yes,
about it,
one
just listen
survivor
to it.
did indeed claim to have survived the cold waters of the Atlantic thanks to whiskey. That man was the chief baker on board the Titanic. How much do you want to bet he was sampling the products from the bar? Charles John Juin was off duty and in his bunk at the time of the impact. Once he felt the collision, he got up to find out what was going on and quickly sent his men up to the lifeboats with bread as provisions. When it came time to get the women and children off the boat, Juin was on the front lines, forcibly getting those that did not want to leave the boat into the lifeboats. It's here that Juin decided to, in his words, have a drop of liquor. When the ship eventually sunk, Juin basically rode it like an elevator slowly sinking into the water but not letting his head below the surface. According to Juin's own testimony, he kept paddling and treading water for 2 hours without feeling the cold, thanks to his booze. When the lifeboats turned up, there wasn't room for Juin, so he held onto the side of the boat as it traveled back to safety. So yes, he apparently survived thanks to booze. What a world.
That is
Number
crazy.
6.
That's absolutely crazy.
Prediction. If you go looking through
This
history,
is crazy.
you'll likely
This
find
prediction
many
is
people who
nuts.
predicted the
And it's having
Titanic
14
sinking,
years
but
to-
few
to
are
do
as
a
haunting
disaster.
as that of the American author Morgan Robertson,
Yeah.
who somehow managed to paint a startlingly accurate picture
Yeah,
of
this
such an
is
instance
scary,
in one of his
see.
stories. In 1898, Robertson wrote a novella called The Wreck
Of the Titan, let's listen
or
to this.
Futility. The short tale follows the saga of a vast ocean liner called the Titan, which hits an iceberg in the North Atlantic and tragically sinks to the ocean's floor for all time. Now, that alone is pretty startling
That
in
is
terms
scary,
of
right?
accurately predicting what would come later, but there's more.
Yeah.
Much like the Titanic, the Titan's disaster is amplified by having far too few lifeboats on board. Another
You
notorious
can't tell me
safety
that this
lapse
man
of
did
the
not-
unsinkable
did
ship.
not predict
In
that
all,
disaster,
it's a
like,
story
he said,
that
like, the
somehow
life
managed to paint an accurate picture of what would be coming just a decade or so later. An impressive and slightly chilling feat. In his later years, Robertson was heralded as a clairvoyant for his impressive prediction of what would happen. But as any modest author would, Robertson rejected the title. To him, the Titan was a story, the Titanic was real life. Number 5. The Wealthiest Journey. If the Titanic were to set sail today, it's a given that we'd be seeing a lot of Instagram photos from influencers brought on to experience this incredible voyage. But while the technology may have changed, the culture really hasn't. Because except for Instagram and influencers, that's pretty much what happened in 1912. The Titanic's maiden voyage was populated by a lot of society's heavy hitters. Celebrities, dignitaries, and wealthy industrialists were pretty much everywhere on the ship. From the elderly owner of Macy's to the notorious widow known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Everyone who was anyone was to be found on this ship, which only makes it more horrifying to know that so many of these people didn't survive. As we're often told, money is not everything in this life. If it were, many of these wealthy figures would have survived on that fateful night. But some wealthy figures, like financier J.P. Morgan, managed to miss this fateful journey through luck or a higher power, depending on what you believe. Morgan's last-minute business delays could well have saved his life, and this is likely a story that echoes for many people who have made their fortune following this fateful night. Number 4. The Underwater Robots. Experts have worked to gain an understanding of what happened to the ship once it sank. That journey finally reached its successful end in 2012, when technology allowed experts to put together what may be the conclusive answer. One big map of the wreck site. The map was put together thanks to an expedition team using sonar images and underwater robots who snapped over 100,000 photos of the wreck. This allowed experts to put together a map showing hundreds of the fallen objects and pieces of the ship on the ocean floor. This is considered the first comprehensive map of the Titanic shipwreck's full debris field, and it's regarded as the most significant.
1, 2, 3, go!
And it's regarded as the most significant achievement in the quest for answers since Robert Ballard discovered the wreckage for the first time in September 1985. This kind of game-changing find could never have happened without the incredible advancements in technology. Today, experts have a far greater understanding of how the Titanic collapsed and its current state than ever before. And be honest, using underwater robots to put together a 3D map of a sunken ship is actually really cool. Number 3. The Belongings. In the decades since Robert Ballard found the wreck of the Titanic, numerous research missions have taken place at the site. In one of these missions, experts discovered what could only be one of the most haunting finds in their career: the belongings of those who perished. In one 1987 research mission, experts managed to recover a purse from the wreck. Inside, they found a trove of priceless jewelry items, likely belonging to one of the wealthier passengers on board. Sometime later, an American salvage company launched an operation to cut a hole in the wreck and retrieve precious artifacts and historical treasures from on board. The act was roundly opposed by the British government at the time, though it should be noted that they went on to display the jewels found in the 1987 research mission. Still, there's something truly haunting about the number of clothes and belongings that must still be down there. For the passengers on board, these belongings were hugely important and largely priceless. Today they live on in eternity, though sadly with nobody to appreciate their value. It's the very place the Titanic was built. It's pretty obvious to see why the Thompson Graving Dock is one of the most notable historical sites in Belfast, but it's also one of the most protected and preserved historical sites in the entirety of the United Kingdom. In 2012, the 100th anniversary to the Titanic sinking, the British government provided £1.5 million, around $2 million, to begin work on preserving and protecting the dock, which opened in 1911, just 1 year before the disaster. This boost in funding is the largest single investment into a historical monument made by the UK's Department of Environment. The money helped build a new structure around the steel dock gates, designed to protect the 880-foot-long dock from flooding and preserve it for generations to come. That $2 million price tag. May sound pretty costly for those of us who have never seen that much money in our lives, but it's probably very worthwhile to pay that to protect such an important local monument.
Yeah.
Number 1, the fake funnel. Yes,
oh yeah,
despite all that has been said about the incredible construction and design of the Titanic, one of the 4 funnels was utterly useless, because, much like a millionaire's home, why not have a space that is only aesthetically useful, right? While 3 of the 4 funnels on the ship were practical and functional, the 4th was just a dummy. In fact, the only reason it was ever installed in the first place was to make the ship look prettier because, at that time, many ocean liners were adopting the aesthetic look of a 4-funnel ship, and the Titanic simply worked to keep up with that. Eventually, that 4th funnel was turned into a ventilation shaft for the ship's kitchen. Make no mistake, that was an afterthought, and it probably didn't make all that much of a difference. Surprisingly, even the press at the time was aware that the 4th funnel was a dummy, and even those on board quickly came to work it out. But today, many people are completely unaware that only 3 of the 4 funnels were practical. You really do learn something new with every video. Did you know any of these chilling facts?
And in the video today, the top 10 conspiracy
now guys,
theories
we actually
Titanic.
we actually
In April 1912, the RMS Titanic set sail on its way to New York City, and it was one of the biggest ocean liners of its time. It is an iceberg, and unfortunately there were only 20 lifeboats on its maiden voyage, which was not enough to save everyone on board. More than 1,500 people died, and the survivors witnessed the boat sink. More than 100 years later, people are still fascinated by the tragedy.
Yep, 110 years ago.
Considered to be one of the most tragic romance movies.
People are still fascinated by it.
Just like any major tragedy around the world, people began to speculate that there may be more to the story. Some secret reasons why the ship sank, as if a massive iceberg was not enough. Well, in the video today, we're looking at 10 conspiracy theories surrounding the Titanic. Number 10, closed watertight doors. When the White Star Line created the Titanic and its sister ships,
the Titanic... This is one of the biggest ones you can easily debunk. So even the Titanic's watertight doors were shut, basically, once you take on so much water, it opens 6 compartments, and you can see a float with 4 compartments flooded. But here's the thing. People would think that would stop it, but they think Titanic's bulkheads were like really low. So basically, what happened was that as soon as one compartment flooded, it basically tipped over into another apartment. So basically,
the Olympic, they were all designed by shipbuilders Holland and Wolff from Belfast. In their designs, the ships were created so that 60 watertight compartments could flood with ocean water and still remain afloat. According to some theorists, they believe that these watertight doors did more harm than good. Some people believe that if it wasn't for the doors, the ship may have filled up with water evenly underneath the entire ship instead of just one side. The idea is that this may have bought the passengers enough extra time to escape. Keep in mind that these doors are the reason why the front of the boat dipped into the water after it hit the iceberg. These same passengers claim that if the water was more evenly distributed, it would have bought the passengers an additional 30 minutes of time to escape.
It wouldn't have.
However, the Discovery Channel tested this theory with a simulation in the documentary in 1998 called Titanic Secrets Revealed. They concluded that if it wasn't for the watertight doors, the ship would have sunk much sooner. Historian Mark Stevenson explains that in a wooden boat, evenly distributing the water would make sense. But since the Titanic was a steel ship, the watertight doors did, in fact, keep it afloat for at least 30 minutes longer than it would have otherwise. Number 9, fire in a coal bunker. Some theorists believe that a fire was burning near the hull of the Titanic.
True. Well, they didn't choose to the sinking, but basically it was that, like Titanic had a coal fire on it, during its maiden voyage,
as 3 weeks before its maiden voyage.
Until
a documentary on Channel 4 in the United Kingdom called Titanic: The New Evidence digs into the theory that the boat sank because of fire rather than ice. The fire would have weakened the steel of the ship and made it easy for an iceberg to tear through the side. This theory comes from photographs of the ship before it set sail, where black marks can be seen. Some people theorize that this is a burn mark of a fire that would have been invisible to the passengers. This theory originated from an article in the New York Tribune which claims that the fire began while the boat was docked in Southampton, England. However, just after the boat sank, people were going wild with their own conspiracy theories. While the documentary uses evidence that has been around for years, there really hasn't been any new discovery that supports this theory. It's entirely possible, but most would agree that regardless of whether the fire was going or not, the iceberg would have still done its damage.
Yeah.
Number 8. Expansion joints theory. This is yet another theory that tries to put the blame on the designers of the Titanic.
Yep.
There were expansion joints at the bottom of the ship, which some theorists believe would have broken the Titanic during any rough storms. Indeed, they believe that it would have taken some...
Let me explain this. So, the reason Titanic snapped in half was basically, because Titanic had a lot of strain on it, because it had water all at the front and no water in the back or the stern section. So basically, because of all that strain, it caused Titanic to snap in half. And basically, the reason the stern's condition
massive
is
as an
really
iceberg
bad
to
is
take it down. A researcher for the History Channel named Rushmore knew and believes that the bottom of the ship did not flood at all, and that the snapping expansion joints caused the boat to break apart. The only evidence that Denoyer has about this idea is that one of the White Star liners that was built later, the HMHS Britannic, had more expansion joints installed as a safety precaution. However, considering just how many boats belonging to the White Star Line were destroyed, it would have been even more shocking if they didn't make any improvements to the designs. To top it all off, the Britannic sank as well in 1914. Number 7, underwater UFO.
Okay,
if you thought you were going to get through a conspiracy list without hearing about aliens,
underwater UFO.
According to a tabloid called Weekly World News, they have so-called evidence that a UFO shot lasers at the Titanic. The scientist, named Dr. Joseph Hostetler, claims that they discovered 3 large holes underneath the ship, which they conclude could only have come from an attack by an underwater alien spacecraft. They also claim that nearby ships lost radio contact with the Titanic, which is why more rescue boats were not able to show up and rescue the survivors. Of course, there is very little evidence to back up this theory, but as with most alien theories, it all comes down to what you believe exists and what you don't. Number 6, time travelers sank the Titanic. Yet another supernatural theory claims that time travelers sank the Titanic. During an interview with a podcast called Star Talk, Neil deGrasse Tyson said,
"It's been rumored that the reason why the Titanic sank is because in the future they invented a time machine, and everyone wanted to go back to the Titanic to see the iceberg when it hits, and then it overloaded the Titanic and it sank."
Of course, he was totally joking, but there are people out there who truly do believe in this theory. A website called Stranger Dimensions took this theory a bit further with their own spin on the idea, saying that the time travelers weren't tourists, but spies paid by JP Morgan to sabotage the ship in order to collide with the iceberg in order to claim the insurance money. Number 5. Number 5, the Federal Reserve Scheme. Financier JP Morgan was the owner of White Star Line, and he had invested a significant amount of money into the Titanic. Before setting sail, he was working on a plan to create the American Federal Reserve to regulate the banking system. There were some outspoken critics of Morgan's ideas, and all of them had originally booked a trip on the ship. Their names were Benjamin Guggenheim, Isa Strauss, David Astor. Morgan and some of his closest friends cancelled their trip on the Titanic at the last minute and survived. His opponents were all on board the Titanic and perished during the sinking of the ship. The Federal Reserve was created the very next year, in 1913. Now, all of that is true, but is it a coincidence, or is it something much darker? There is indeed so much more to this theory that it could be its own video in itself. It involves the Rothschild family and even the Illuminati. However, if we sum everything up, the idea is that evil bankers wanted control over the US economy so badly that they were willing to stage a wreck, killing more than 1,000 people in order to take out a handful of men. If that is true, many members of the crew, including the captain, would have had to be involved.
Absolutely no sense. All the captain wasn't even involved because at the time of the collision.
Attacked by a German
this one I've heard, but it won't work. There is no way a German U-boat could get out that far into the Atlantic. Like, she was really far into the Atlantic. There's no way
the RMS Lusitania was attacked by a German submarine that sank. Considering that both boats were made by the same company, they were comparable sizes and built with similar materials, conspiracy theorists have argued that the Titanic may have been hit by a German submarine as well. A conspiracy theorist named Dr. Franklin Rule talked about this idea on a TV series called Mysteries from Beyond the Other Dominion, and he later talked about it for the Huffington Post. Apparently, survivors heard sounds of explosions on the ship. There were also lights from a ship seen in the distance, which survivors attributed to a ship called the Californian. However, as Dr. Rule claims, the Californian saw lights in the distance as well. This has led to the theory that a third ship, in this case a German U-boat, would have been there and slipped underneath the water and never to be seen again. However, World War I did not begin until 1914. The Titanic sank in 1912, so there would be no reason for Germany to attack the ship at that time. In his article, the only sources Dr. Rule links to for this theory are his own videos, as well as psychic premonitions that people had before the crash. Number 3. The Curse of the Pharaoh. In 1889, the British Museum acquired an Egyptian artifact known as the Unlucky Mummy. This is due to the fact that its previous owners had some serious bad luck. While this is all true, the conspiracy begins when some believe that the new owner of the mummy was trying to board the Titanic in 1912. Conspiracy theorists believe that the same curse that brought misfortune to all of the other owners of this mummy is to blame for the Titanic sinking. Of course, this theory has several holes in it. For one, you would have to believe in the mummy's curse. Secondly, there is no evidence that shows that the mummy was actually on board the ship. And if it truly was on the ship, the likelihood that someone would have prioritized an artifact to take up space on a lifeboat in place of other human beings is also pretty ridiculous. And how do we know it would have to be on a lifeboat? Well, that's because the mummy is today on display at the British Museum. Number 2, the No Pope Curse. A publication from 1987 claims that on the hull of the Titanic there were the numbers 390904. When seen in a mirror, the numbers appear to be the word No Pope. The construction of White Star Line ships was completed in Belfast. As the story goes, many of the shipyard workers were Catholic, and they saw this as a bad omen that God would not be protecting this ship, and it was truly doomed to sink. Snopes investigated this story and discovered that the number on the Titanic's hull was actually 131428. Not only is the number wrong though, but the vast majority of shipyard workers were actually Protestant, not Catholic. And even if the story had been true, one would still have to believe in the supernatural for this conspiracy theory to hold any weight. Number 1, the Olympic insurance claim.
Okay, this is the biggest one. The Titanic and Olympic theory switch. Well, I've got 40 minutes, so yeah, but let me talk about this. Spend a few minutes on this. So this was basically this is what people believed. So Titanic and Olympic had the nameplate switched because basically the Olympic took on a lot of damage during its hot collision, and they couldn't fund repairs. So what they did, they slapped Titanic's nameplate onto Olympic, and Olympic's name was the Titanic. But there is a few issues. First of all, the ships, even though they look extremely similar, well, they had differences. Secondly, Titanic and Olympic would have had to be with each other for a long amount of time. The longest they were together were 38 days. And during that time, they would have to strip Olympic down, strip Titanic down, and literally move everything onto the other ships. And apparently, it took them over 100 days to fit the Olympic out. Which meant there was absolute no way in hell that they could have switched it. And also,
the most well-known and widespread conspiracy theory about the Titanic is that the White Star Line switched out the Titanic for its sister ship, the Olympic. The RMS Olympic was the first of the massive ocean liners, but unfortunately it collided with another ship and became very damaged. Edward Smith, the captain of the Olympic, was to blame for the accident, and White Star Line did not get any money from their insurance company to pay for the repairs. Smith became the captain of the Titanic as well, and he went down with the ship. Some theorists believe that the Olympic was quickly repaired with parts from the Titanic and set sail in the Titanic's place. Considering that the two ships were almost identical, people believe this must have been an easy switch. When it sank as well, the White Star Line was able to get millions from the insurance claim. However, in a documentary done by Sky, it was revealed that the dives from the wreckage of the Titanic found steel parts stamped with the number 401, which were all original Titanic parts. If it were actually the Olympic, as the theory claims, there would be at least some remnants, parts labelled with its serial number, which was 400. There are none. This proves that the ship that sank was, in fact, the Titanic. Not only that, but there were roughly 15,000 Irish men working on these ships, and the sheer number of people means that the likelihood that all of them could have kept quiet about this secret
is
slim to none,
and they would have to kept quiet, which would have been very unlikely.
So I really hope you found that video interesting, and don't forget we put out brand new videos just like this.
10 shocking theories that show the other side of history. People share except
for movies starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet.
This is bad.
You probably think you know all there is to know about the Titanic tragedy, or so you thought.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
From the crash being predicted in a book over a decade earlier to a full moon causing the iceberg to move into the path of the ship, here are 15 bone-chilling Titanic facts no one knew. Number 50. The sinking of the Titanic was predicted in a novel over a decade earlier. Well, sort of. The American author Morgan Andrew Robinson wrote a book called Futility, where a boat called the Titan met its final end through crashing into a huge iceberg. But that's only the beginning of the spookiness. The ship, the Titan, was considered the largest ship of its day at 800 feet in length, just like the Titanic, which was only slightly larger at 882 feet in length. Both were considered unsinkable and have eerily similar endings. The Titan was moving too fast one April night at a speed of 25 knots and hit an iceberg in the bitterly cold North Atlantic Sea about 400 miles from Newfoundland. Whereas the Titanic was also going too fast one April night at a speed of 23 knots and also hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic, 400 miles from Newfoundland. Spooky coincidences, to say the least.
That is crazy.
Had less than half the lifeboats required to fit the number of passengers on board, and when the boats sank, they went down the same way. Bow first. Robinson's book mentioned the loss of 2,500 souls, which is creepily similar to the 2,208 people who lost their lives on the Titanic.
Well,
if you feel weirded out by these similarities, imagine how Morgan Andrew Robinson felt when he heard of the Titanic sinking. Before we go on, like this video, smash the subscribe button and click the notification bell right now for the star topic. So sometimes with our star topics, we like to take a teensy bit of a diversion from the main theme of the video to show you the most extreme example of the topic we're discussing, and often an example that's a wee bit debatable. So before we dive back into looking at more bone-chilling Titanic facts, give this theory that the famous vessel actually crashed into Godzilla and not an iceberg a moment of your time. Yeah, that's true. Some people genuinely believe that the great scaly legend was the reason the unsinkable ship actually sank. Perhaps he was just going for a late-night dip in the North Atlantic Sea and was just as surprised as the crew when he saw a large ship come crashing into him. With many of the crew not surviving to tell the whole truth, it could be true. Emphasis on the could. I'm gonna stick with the iceberg story, although who really knows? If it was Godzilla, they've done a very good job of keeping a low profile and getting away with it. Although a movie where the Titanic crashes into Godzilla is something I would definitely be up for watching. Comment down below with the hashtag StarTopic and let us know your opinion in relation to what we just showed on screen. With that said, let's keep things moving. Number 14. The full moon crashed the Titanic. The moon may have actually sunk the Titanic. On January 4th, 1912, there was a remarkable supermoon. What does this mean? Well, the moon was exceptionally close to the Earth, and this alignment of the moon and the sun on opposite sides of the Earth could have led to the creation of extra high and extra low tides of the ocean.
And these low tides would basically mean
these tides could have led to the Titanic crashing into the iceberg. Amazingly, this was the closest lunar approach since 796 AD. We're still yet to see the next of these supermoons, as a similar one isn't forecasted to happen until the year 2257. Whilst these crazily high and low tides might sound like great news for surfers looking to catch a rad wave, these spring tides may have actually dislodged icebergs from the coast of Canada's Labrador and Newfoundland and thrown them into the Titanic's
well for
path.
icebergs to get that far into the Atlantic,
These tumultuous tides could have also thrown older icebergs which had drifted towards the seabed back to the surface. The moon can be a real lunatic sometimes.
Pretty interesting.
Number 13. Did an optical illusion sink the Titanic? An optical illusion may have caused the Titanic to not see the incoming iceberg in a bizarre event only science can explain. You've probably heard of a mirage before, but think that they occur on desert islands when survivors are searching for water. But it is believed that the creation of a mirage on the sea's surface led to this optical illusion, where the crew didn't see the incoming icebergs on that fateful night. This mirage was potentially caused by the combination of cold and warm air in the North Atlantic, which merged to hide the icebergs on the horizon. When the bodies of those from the ship were collected, it was discovered that the air temperature jumped from 56 degrees to 36 degrees in less than half a mile. This crazy jump in temperature is likely to have caused the bending of light rays and a miraging effect to occur. The people on the lookout from the Titanic would usually use the sky as a way of silhouetting any incoming object. But of course, if there's a mirage, the visibility is severely weakened. It's so weird to think that the sinking of the unsinkable ship was potentially caused by a simple difference in temperature.
They couldn't see the iceberg at all.
Number
half an hour, and then it happened.
Titanic 2.
Oh yeah.
It's quite a shame that we won't be able to marvel at the giant beauty of the Titanic with our own eyes in our lifetime. Or will we? Titanic 2 is reportedly in the works. DiCaprio and Winslet won't be reprising the roles, but rather an Australian billionaire fancies building another luxury ship.
But apparently it's still in,
rich Aussie's name, and he
because
plans on making an exact replica of the famous
the ship
vessel
hasn't
that sunk
even been
more
laid
than
down yet.
100 years
But if
ago.
it does
Palmer
happen,
and his team
you
have
know
been
for a
constructing the
fact
ship
I am
since
boarding this ship
2012
in my life.
China, with the
I will
plan
go on
being
this
to
ship.
roll the
I don't
vessel's
care.
maiden voyage
I
in a
will
trip
go.
from China to Dubai in 2022. After this, with the hope that they won't come across any icy speed bumps, they plan on going to Southampton, England, and go along the familiar stomping ground of its predecessor across the North Atlantic. Sequels are usually disappointing, but I have hope for this one. Number 11.
Clear the wall, let's go! Get him out, boy!
Passengers could have been saved.
Yep,
You'd think
because
any nearby ship would
they could
intervene
have
and help the
more
sinking
lifeboats,
Titanic, right? That is
a newer
sadly
ship,
not the
so they
case,
could have got more
apparently.
people off
Whilst the
Titanic.
Titanic was slowly sinking into the ocean, a nearby ship allegedly ignored its distress signals.
Because basically,
The
well,
SS
early in the day,
California was
apparently,
the closest ship
people
to
in Titanic were
Titanic when
really
it
rude to the
crashed,
Californian,
but
which
did
basically
nothing
caused them to
help.
close off
Shockingly,
their
the ship
comms.
and its captain,
Which
Stanley
basically
Lord,
meant,
did not intervene, even after
they
seeing
couldn't,
distress
it
rockets
basically meant
fly into
Titanic
the night
couldn't
sky from the Titanic. Not only this, but a Norwegian ship, the Samson, could also have been
Riders
nearby to help.
Bizarrely,
The Samson was thought to have ignored the Titanic's distress signals for fears that they would be prosecuted for illegally hunting seals. Rather than risk being caught, they just pretended they didn't see anything, allegedly. Apparently, the Titanic didn't have any red rockets with them, so they had to settle for sending white rockets up into the air. The crew of the Californian would later testify that they believed this was a show of entertainment for the passengers, rather than a cry for help. Despite the actions of the Californian and its captain, they did not spend any time behind bars, as it was concluded that if they had intervened, it wasn't likely that they would have saved any more lives than the ship Carpathia. Unlike the other two, Carpathia did intervene and saved many lives of those on board
They could have gotten to them in like 2 hours if they had 20 extra minutes.
Musicians continued to play as the ship sank. When the Titanic was tragically sinking, the ship's band attempted to hide the sounds of the panicking passengers with their own tunes. That's right, for 2 hours after the liner hit the iceberg, the screams of the passengers were accompanied by waltzes, hymns, and lullabies, all in an attempt to calm the passengers. Trying to keep the mood jolly when you're sinking into the freezing North Atlantic Sea must have been a tough task.
Didn't go off until literally like a minute before.
minutes of music in a time of crisis. I guess anything to masquerade the sounds of sobbing ringing out from those waiting to board the few lifeboats available would be useful. But what was the final song played on board the damn ship?
My God,
well, the band leader, Wallace Hartley, reportedly said that if he was on a sinking ship, he would gather his band to play either Nearer My God to Thee or Oh God Our Help in Ages Past. Despite this claim, Harold Bride, a wireless operator on the Titanic who survived the sinking, told the New York Times that the hymn Autumn was the final song before the ship fully submerged and the sea tragically consumed those on board, including the band members. That sounds like the strangest concert I've ever heard of.
Didn't go off until literally
lifeboat drill was cancelled. The Titanic was meant to have a lifeboat drill on the day it sank, which could have saved the lives of some on board. Why didn't it go ahead? No one knows, but Captain Smith decided to randomly cancel it without giving much reason. This would prove fatal, as later that night, when the giant ship crashed into an iceberg, many of the officers on duty had no clue what the weight limit of the lifeboats was. If you don't know what the weight limit is, then you don't know how many people can fit onto a lifeboat. The last thing you want is to sink the fragile wooden boat when you're stranded at sea. This lack of knowledge, not helped by the canceled drill, meant many lifeboats were only half full when they were set off into the sea. With a drill and a comprehensive knowledge of the lifeboat's capacity, an estimated 400 additional lives may have been saved. What a fatal mistake. Number 8. Why weren't there enough lifeboats? Everyone's heard of the tale of the Titanic not having enough lifeboats to cater to its passengers. Whilst this can be looked down upon as a foolish and arrogant mistake, it's not all that it appears to be. The Titanic had 20 lifeboats on board for its passengers and crew of 2,223 on board. But 20 lifeboats are only capable of holding 1,178 people. Even less when you consider they weren't filled properly.
Well, keep checking them. Keep looking. Is there anyone alive out there?
So why didn't the Titanic have more lifeboats? Well, they actually had 4 more boats than they were required to by law based on their size. See, there used to be a silly way of working out how many lifeboats to include based on the gross tonnage of a vessel, not by how many passengers were on board. Some say they just thought the ship was unsinkable and didn't prepare well enough. Well, that's not true. The Titanic wasn't thought to be unsinkable before it sunk, but rather it was seen as so big that it would take around a week to actually sink, not 3 hours. Besides, if it did sink, the lifeboats were only thought to be needed to transport passengers across to a waiting ship, not drift in the ocean for hours. Sadly, it took a tragedy for people to learn from their mistakes, as nowadays it is in British and American law that a ship must have enough lifeboats for 100% of those on board.
Which states the automated contacts disaster, Olympic was refitted with more lifeboats, and Titanic sister Titanic, which is the new ship that being built, they had a lot of safety changes added to it, including more lifeboats.
The Titanic victims remain unknown. Many of the tragic lives lost when the Titanic sunk have not been recovered. Whilst 1,500 people were thought to have died from the infamous crash with the iceberg, only 340 bodies were recovered. That means 1,160 remain lost at the bottom of the sea. The waters surrounding the Titanic were thought to be so cold that it only took 30 minutes for people in the water to perish. Those who succumbed to the freezing temperatures and didn't wear a life jacket fell like rain through the ocean, drifting harrowingly towards the seabed. Due to the ocean being undersaturated in calcium carbonate and hungry local animals, the entire skeletons of bodies vanished. Photographs released in 2010 revealed that all that remained of bodies were clothing, such as shoes, which remained untouched. This, and the fact that there may be better preserved bodies hidden within the ship, make excavating the ship a morally questionable decision. Rather than lifting the beast of a ship from the ocean's floor to marvel at, for now, the consensus is to leave it where it is, as it would be pretty disrespectful to pull apart the gravesite. Number 6. Miss Unsinkable.
Oh yeah.
Some people are just incredibly lucky, and they don't come much luckier than Violet Jessup. Born in 1887 in Argentina to Irish immigrants, Violet and her family moved to Britain after the death of her father, where she decided to follow in her mother's footsteps and become a ship stewardess. Being a young, attractive woman made her job difficult, particularly with the multiple marriage proposals of her patients. Nevertheless, she continued and would end up working on the Olympic in 1911 and survive its crash with the HMS Hawk. After being convinced by her family, Violet took a job on no other than the Titanic. This would obviously sink, and once again, Violet emerged relatively unscathed thanks to a lifeboat, with her main annoyance being that she forgot her toothbrush on board. Next, she was a nurse on Titanic's sister ship, the Titanic, which was, of course, sunk by a mine left by a German U-boat. Violet jumped ship and smacked her head, her only sustained injury. Years would go by before she went to the doctors due to continued headaches. It was only then that Violet discovered she had fractured her skull. Despite coming close to death on many occasions, Violet would live until the ripe old age of 81, where she passed away from congestive heart failure. Number 5. The Engineer's Sacrifice.
I mentioned
You don't hear too much about the engineers of the Titanic and their heroics, but you should really get to know them. All of the engineers on board the Titanic tragically died when the ship sunk beneath the waves. But because none of them survived, their tale is often not mentioned in the tale of the Titanic. So, what did they do? These brave set of people stayed on the damned ship to crucially keep it afloat longer, essentially sacrificing themselves to help save the lives of others.
And they ought to stay down there as long as Titanic can float as long as they possibly could.
Through operating the pumps in the forward compartments and retaining the steam in the boiler room, these brave people did all they possibly could to prolong the inevitable sinking and prevent the boiler from exploding. Not only this, but their actions meant the lights and electricity on board were running right up until 2 minutes before the huge ship finally went down beneath the waves.
Crazy.
These noble actions are thought to have delayed the sinking of the ship by over an hour, giving those on board enough time to deploy and fill nearly all of the lifeboats on board. Astonishing stuff. Talk about real-life heroes. Number 4. Was one person responsible for the Titanic disaster? When a tragedy like the sinking of the Titanic occurs, many people try and find someone to point the blame at. In this case, Captain E.J. Smith is the alleged culprit, and they have quite a few reasons why he is to blame. The Titanic was traveling at full speed, 22 knots, when it sailed across the North Atlantic and straight into an iceberg. Some say that Smith was traveling so fast because he was trying to beat the crossing time of Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. Was this competitiveness really to blame? According to multiple testifying captains, it was perfectly safe to travel at full speed in the clear weather that the Titanic had experienced that night. Anyways, the reason for the speed has been partly blamed on a fire in the ship's coal bunker, rather than Captain Smith being an adrenaline junkie. There have also been claims that Smith was drunk whilst on duty, which has been denied continuously. Smith was one of White Star's best captains, with the Titanic being the 4th large ship he had taken charge of on its maiden voyage. A man of such experience and reputation was not to blame for the disastrous collision. Despite the multiple allegations thrown at him, none of them stick. Number 3. Titanic had fatal.
Oh yeah, it did. Oh yeah, that's how that did have some fatal flaws. The design specifically has some very big flaws in it.
Whilst many think of the Titanic as being strong and sturdy, the reality is far from this. Many people initially thought that the ship had sunk intact, but the truth is, it didn't. When an American French expedition to the site of the ship in 1985 was launched, they discovered that the ship had actually broken apart whilst on the ocean's surface. But why did this happen? A quick look at the materials used reveals the answers. The 3 million rivets that held the whole steel plates together were discovered to have contained a lot of slag. Yeah, you heard that right. Which is a smelting residue that can make metal split apart. The presence of slags weakened the ship and made the impact from the iceberg even more devastating. This wasn't the ship's only problem, but its high sulfur content meant that when the ship got colder, it got more and more brittle and prone to breaking. It looks like the ship never stood a chance. If only they spent more time and money on the outside of the vessel rather than the elegant interiors. Number 2. The Titanic had real-life love stories. Millions of fans worldwide saw the Titanic film's love interests, Jack and Rose, and continue to call them couple goals, lap up their story, and cry out enough teardrops to drown their own vessel. Yet, whilst you might think that it was the work of a great script, their love story isn't far from the truth. While they weren't DiCaprio or Winslet, there were, in fact, 13 known honeymooning couples on the Titanic. The tragic tale of the famous millionaire J.J. Astor and his young, pregnant wife is a real tearjerker. The husband helped the love of his life onto a lifeboat, but he sadly stayed behind and died on board the Titanic. Whilst the father died, the mother survived and gave birth to John Jacob Astor VI later that year. Apparently, J.J. Astor would have been allowed into the boat had the crew members known she was expecting a child. I can only imagine how emotional it must have been to be separated from your pregnant spouse in already such a heartbreaking event. I still believe Jack could have fit on that door with Rose, though.
Oh, yeah.
Number 1. The film made enough money to build a fleet of Titanics. When you think of the Titanic, you think big and grand, diamonds and expensive clothes being flaunted left, right, and center at expensive dinners and dining halls with the finest of cutlery and long, majestic halls and staircases with unrivaled luxury. Well, while it was no doubt an expensive boat, it is mind-blowing to hear that the film made so much more than the cost of this iconic vessel. While the ship cost around $197 million, if you include inflation accumulated over the years, it shies in comparison with the astounding amount of money made by James Cameron's Academy Award-winning 1997 film, which made around $2.2 billion worldwide. That is a stupid amount of money. That's enough money to buy a fleet of 11.2 Titanics. I know the film was good, but wow. To be fair, it did cost around $200 million to make the film. DiCaprio must have been counting his lucky stars that he took a pay cut in favor of splitting first dollar gross point, as the move earned him a reported $50 million. Not bad going, seeing as it only took 7 months to film. That boils down to a decent hourly wage, in my opinion. I can't wait to casually drop my newfound knowledge.
By the time this video's done, guys, it will hit 11. It should hit 11:38, which means, we're really done.
One of the most enduring stories about what happened in the early morning of April 15th, 1912, was that of the band playing on as the Titanic sank. There were 8 musicians led by bandmaster Wallace Hartley. They joined the ship at Southampton and were paid 1 shilling a month for their trouble. Sadly, none of them survived the disaster. If you were a member of the band aboard the Titanic, you really had to be on your toes. You were there to provide constant entertainment for the many fancy passengers, and if they wanted a tune, you had better be ready to belt one out. This involved memorizing the White Star Line songbook. The White Star Line was also called the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, a British shipping firm. We're not talking a few ditties here. The book contained a total of, guess how many songs? 352. The band operated as a kind of living jukebox for the rich and were quite talented. Number 9. The disaster was predicted. A chilling secret about the Titanic is how the disaster was predicted by 2 authors in the previous century.
2 authors!
They wrote 2 novellas that described situations similar to what occurred that fateful night in 1912. Both authors aimed to warn readers of the hazards of ocean travel, and they proved to be worryingly correct. T. Stead wrote How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor in 1886. Not a catchy title, I know, but the important thing is his depiction of an ocean liner traveling in the fog which strikes another boat and sinks, causing many deaths. The really weird thing is that Stead ended up as a passenger aboard the Titanic. Spooky, right? I've heard of life imitating art, but that's just crazy. Think that sounds incredible? Well, Morgan Robertson had another tale to tell.
This
he
guy,
may not have perished on the Titanic,
but
he created a story that mirrored the disaster
there
in some unbelievable ways.
No way to predict
the wreck of the Titan, or Futility, from 1898, featured a ship called the Titan, which was called unsinkable just like the Titanic. The boat also hit an iceberg in April, the very same month. Coincidence? Or excellent prediction? And now for number 8, but first, while many people think the Titanic was the worst ship disaster in history, it is actually ranked 3rd in terms of loss of life. Can you name the deadliest ship disaster in history? Write your guess in the comments. The answer is coming up. And if you are new here, welcome, and be sure to subscribe before you leave. We'd love to have you. Right, subs? Number 8. Japanese survivor ridiculed. After surviving a terrible tragedy at sea, you'd think people would cut you some slack, right? Wrong. That wasn't the case for poor Masafumi Hosono, a civil servant from Japan. He was the only Japanese person on board the Titanic, and it turned out the disaster was just the beginning of his troubles. Because he had allegedly disguised himself as a woman in order to get on a lifeboat, he faced shame and abuse when he got back to his home country. He was seen as a coward and became the focus of what the Japanese call muhara chibu, meaning social exclusion. He lost his job, and people even wrote letters asking him to commit suicide for dishonoring his nation. They would rather he'd stayed and gone down with the ship. The government kept employing Hosono for his skills, but things were never the same again. He passed away in 1939 at the age of 68. Number 7. Nazi propaganda. When you think of movies about the Titanic, James Cameron, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Kate Winslet spring to mind, right? Well, there's someone else you may not know about who made a film about the disaster, Joseph Goebbels. Yes, you heard that correctly. Goebbels, the famous Nazi, shot a propaganda movie about the Titanic for Hitler. How is the Titanic a good subject for the Nazi war effort? Well, Goebbels presented the British as villains obsessed with trying to break the record for crossing the Atlantic. In doing so, they ignored safety concerns and caused the tragedy because of their arrogance. Of course, the hero of the whole thing, as you'd expect, was a German crewman. The Nazi Ministry of Propaganda spent the current equivalent of $180 million on the project, directed by Herbert Selpin. Selpin was a notorious drunk and made all manner of demands, including the building of a giant model ship, which was then abandoned. He was eventually arrested for insulting the regime and was murdered in prison. Yeah, not a happy ending. The Nazi version of the Titanic was released in 1943 and soon sank without a trace. Get it? In other words, it was not a box office hit. The film was rediscovered in 2005, though snippets were used in the 1958 classic A Night to Remember. So that Nazi money was put to good use for a decent movie instead. One more score for the Allies, Adolf. Number 6. People died building it. It wasn't just the passengers on the Titanic who suffered a terrible fate. Building the ship was also a dangerous business. A total of 8 men died from things like falling and fracturing their skulls to being crushed underneath timbers. As well as deaths, there were 246 accidents, 28 of which were classed as serious. The Titanic was constructed at the Harland & Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, over a period of 2 years between 1909 and 1911. 3,000 men were employed to work on the ship, so while 8 is only a fraction of that number, these are still pretty shocking statistics. Now the goal for the accident rate is always 0. In fact, there was a horrible saying in the industry that went 1 death for every 100,000 pounds spent. The Titanic cost £1.5 million, so if anything, the figure of 8 was a lucky escape for the construction team. It was expected that 15 of them would have died at least. There's a thought that would cheer you up on your way to work, huh? Number 5. No binoculars. One of the most shocking details about the Titanic disaster was the speed at which it all happened. The iceberg was only spotted a nerve-shredding 37 seconds before impact. Could anything have prevented the fatal collision? Some believe if a pair of binoculars had been at hand, the whole disaster could have been avoided. Unfortunately, there were some binoculars on board, but under lock and key in the crow's nest. The sailor who had the key, David Blair, left the ship and accidentally took it with him. It's kind of debatable whether having the binoculars would have made any difference, since there was no moon to light the way, among other factors. The Titanic's lookout was Fred Fleet, and in his defense, He argued that if he'd had binoculars, they wouldn't have hit the iceberg.
Yep.
Tragically, Fred Fleet committed suicide in 1965 following the death of his wife.
Oh.
In 2012, the year of the centennial, he made headlines again when some sick puppies stole wreaths from his graveside, and what's worse, left a pair of binoculars with a note apologizing
for
being
I heard
100 years late. We know the
the
ship hit an iceberg, but man,
the guy went to his grave, had a note,
Aged 36 to 40,
and the binoculars. The exact one. The exact one he forgot to the binoculars was actually 100 years earlier.
Number 4. No fatalities reported. Over 1,500 people lost their lives on the Titanic, but when news of the tragedy broke, the reporting was very different. The American press were closer to the action and relayed the terrible news that many had died. However, when it came to countries like the UK, they decided to go in another direction. Because details were sketchy, sources such as the Belfast Telegraph and the Daily Mail reported no fatalities.
Yep.
That's right, the most famous maritime disaster in history, and apparently no one was killed. You can imagine the horror the passengers' families must have gone through when they finally discovered the truth.
Yep.
It's understandable in a weird way because editors were trying to keep people's spirits up since they didn't have any official numbers. But the decision to rush the story so it got on the newsstands faster was a big miscalculation and wound up doing more harm than good. Number 3. The wreckage is disappearing. Although the wreck of the Titanic is preserved in salt water 3.8 kilometers below the surface of the Atlantic, it won't stay that way much longer. That's because it's being slowly eaten away by a new type of bacteria. In fact, some experts believe it has 20 years left to go max before it's gone forever. The wreck was found in 1985, and did you know that this was actually an accident? The U.S. Navy were trying to locate 2 defunct Cold War submarines and stumbled upon the legendary ship in the process. They discovered it between the 2 submarines. Pretty cool, huh? The metal-eating bacteria was identified on rusticles, long points like icicles only made of rust, and it was named Halomonas Titanicae in honor of the vessel it was, well, chowing down on. Thankfully, James Cameron and his friends have spent many long hours capturing the wreckage on film for posterity. Number 2. 88 years to die. Remember when I told you about the Titanic band? Those guys were as brave as they come. Not only did they lose their lives, but they were also said to have played music as the ship was going down, right until their final moments when they all perished. So you know a little bit about Wallace Hartley, but the story of Roger? According to reports, he'd actually warned the Titanic about the ice over the radio, but received a rude response in return. Unsinkable and all that. Captain Lord then went to bed before being woken by his crew, who had spotted distress rockets being launched from the Titanic. For some reason, Lord didn't think that these were serious and believed them to be signals rather than a call for help. The wireless operator had been stood down for the night, so they didn't receive any communications from the stricken ship. Eventually, another wireless operator started his shift, and when he switched on the radio, all hell broke loose. Captain Lord took the Californian out to the Titanic, but by that stage, another vessel, the RMS Carpathia, had arrived to try and save passengers. Once news broke that the Californian hadn't immediately come to the Titanic's aid, Lord lost his job and spent the rest of his life battling the decision. As for the Californian, well, it was a victim of a German U-boat during World War I, and you've guessed it, sank. He was evasive about the situation when questioned, and his account contradicted that of other crew members. This spelled disaster for Lord's career, but something good did come out of the tragic situation. From that point on, maritime law was changed so that wireless communication at sea stayed open round the clock. It's an important lesson to learn that the sea never sleeps. Thanks for watching. Do you have any secret? Thanks for watching. Do you?
And well, guys, we've got 2 minutes. So for the next 2 minutes, I'm gonna go quiet, and that'll be the end of the stream. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the stream today. And until the next video, I'll see you all again very soon. It was around this time, guys, 110 years ago, Titanic was what the iceberg. So, the next minute, for the next 40 to 45 seconds, I'm gonna go dead quiet as Titanic would have broken out at this time, and yeah. And this is for those 1,500 people that died that tragic night 110 years ago. It is now exactly 11:40, guys. It is now exactly 11:40. The moment Titanic struck that berg 110 years ago. So I'm gonna go quiet for the next 2 minutes, and then after that, that'll be the wrap up of the stream. But this is for all those people who lost their lives in that tragedy 110 years ago today.